One stormy night in the Montana mountains, a woman living alone hears three violent knocks on her door. Outside stands a stranger, blood-soaked in his shirt, clutching his shivering son in the deadly cold. She could have closed the door, she should have, but she didn't. And that decision changed her life forever. Today's story will keep you glued to the screen until the very end. Please like, comment the city country you're watching from, so I know how far my story has progressed, and subscribe to be part of our family and don't miss the next stories. The wind came down from the peaks like something that had been holding its breath for months. Evelyn Hartwell heard it before she felt it, a low, sustained pressure against the north wall of the cabin that made the logs creak and the iron stove tick. She'd grown up with Montana winters. She knew the difference between a storm that blew through and a storm that settled in like an unwanted guest who had nowhere else to be. This was the second kind, the kind her father used to call a stayer. She stood at the kitchen window for a moment, holding a cracked mug of coffee that had gone cold without her noticing, and watched the last of the afternoon light disappear behind the ridge. The pines were bending, not swaying, bending, their tops pulled hard to the southeast like they were trying to lie down and escape the whole situation. Snow came sideways. The yard, what she could still see of it, was already white and shapeless, the fence line barely visible, just a dark stitch running through the white nothing. She'd been meaning to fix that fence for 3 weeks. She pulled herself away from the window and moved back to the stove. Dinner was a modest affair. Half a pot of bean soup with a heel of bread she should have eaten 2 days ago. She had enough firewood stacked on the porch to last another 4 or 5 days, longer if she was careful. And the root cellar had dried beans, 2 jars of pickled cabbage, some hard cheese wrapped in cloth, and a sack of cornmeal that was down to maybe 6 pounds. It was enough, probably enough. She'd gotten through worse stretches than this on less. That was the thing about living alone in a place that most people would describe as remote. You stopped thinking about comfort and started thinking in pure arithmetic. How many days of wood? How many pounds of meal? How many miles to the nearest supply town, which was Harlan's Crossing? And whether the pass road would be passable after a storm like this? And the answer to that last question was almost certainly not for at least a week. She sat down at the table and ate without tasting much and listened to the storm build. The cabin had been her father's before it was hers. Franklin Hartwell had built it 40 years ago with 2 brothers who'd since died, dragging timber up a slope that no sensible man would have chosen to drag timber up because Franklin Hartwell had a particular stubbornness when it came to elevation. He wanted to see. He'd said that more than once, sitting in the same chair where Evelyn now sat, looking out toward where the valley opened up on clear days. I want to be able to see what's coming. Well, you could see plenty from up here, but you couldn't always stop what you saw from arriving. Her mother had lasted 12 years on this mountain before the isolation wore through her like water through limestone, slow and patient and eventually total. She'd gone back to her sister in Billings and written letters for a while and then stopped writing letters. Evelyn had been 9. Franklin never remarried, never seemed to seriously consider it, and raised his daughter the only way he knew how, by treating her like a partner rather than a child. By the time she was 14, she could repair a roof, track a deer, set a bone if she had to, and read a legal document well enough to know when someone was trying to cheat her. He died 4 years ago. A quiet death, which surprised everyone who knew him, because Franklin Hartwell had been a loud, physical, argumentative man his entire life. A stroke took him on a Tuesday morning while he was splitting kindling, and he was gone before she'd finished her coffee. She'd found him on his side in the snow by the woodpile, the hatchet still in his hand. She'd buried him on the south slope, where the soil was softer, under a pine that had a double trunk growing from a single base. It seemed like a thing he would have appreciated. After that, the cabin was hers, the land was hers, the debt was hers. Franklin had borrowed against the property 8 years before he died to rebuild the barn after a fire took it, and the note was still outstanding at a bank in Harlan's Crossing that had since been acquired by a larger concern out of Billings. Every spring Evelyn paid what she could on the interest, and every fall she paid a little more on the principal, and every winter she recalculated how many more years this arrangement could continue. The numbers were not encouraging. The numbers, in fact, required a fairly optimistic set of assumptions to not be completely bleak. But she stayed. She'd asked herself why, more than once, sitting at this same table with a lamp throwing yellow shadows across the log walls. The land was hard. The winters were long. The neighbors, what few there were, kept to themselves, and the ones who didn't were the kind of people you wished would start. She had no husband, no children, no particular prospects for either, and the town of Harlan's Crossing viewed her with the particular blend of pity and suspicion that small communities reserve for women who insist on living outside the configurations those communities consider normal. She stayed because this was the only place that felt like hers. Not comfortable, not easy, but hers. Bought. The storm was at full voice by 8 o'clock. The stove had been banked for the night, and Evelyn was in bed with 2 wool blankets and a quilt her father had bought from a Crow woman years ago. Thick, practical, worn down to a beautiful softness, reading by candlelight, which was the one luxury she permitted herself freely. She read whatever she could get. Newspapers 6 weeks old, catalogs, the same 3 novels she'd carried up here from her father's small collection and read so many times she could have recited passages from any of them by heart. She was 3 pages into a chapter she'd read at least 9 times when she heard the first sound. She stopped reading. The wind was constant enough that she'd partially stopped hearing it, the way you stop hearing a clock after a while, your brain deciding it's not worth cataloging. But underneath the wind's steady roar, she'd heard something different, something rhythmic. Or maybe not. Maybe it was a branch against the porch rail, or an animal taking shelter under the eaves. She waited. Then it came again. 3 sharp knocks, heavy and deliberate, the kind you made when your hands were cold and your strength was mostly gone, and you needed to make sure you were heard. Evelyn sat up. Her first instinct was not to open the door. That was the honest truth of it, and she was not a woman who prettied up her honest truths. Strangers who appeared at your door in the middle of a blizzard at night were not, as a general rule, the kind of strangers you wanted on your porch. She'd grown up with enough stories, real stories, not the cautionary ones people told children, to know that isolation made people desperate, and desperation made people unpredictable. She was alone. She was a woman alone. That was a different arithmetic than the arithmetic of firewood and cornmeal, but it was just as real. She sat still for a moment, listening. The knocking came again, and this time there was something else layered underneath it. A voice. She couldn't make out words, just tone, which was not the tone of threat or aggression, but the tone of something much harder to dismiss. It was the tone of pure need, stripped down and unadorned, the sound of someone past the point where dignity was a relevant consideration. And then, underneath the voice, something higher, thinner. A child. Evelyn was out of bed before she'd finished deciding to be. She pulled her wool coat over her nightshirt, shoved her feet into her boots without bothering to lace them, took the shotgun off its pegs above the door, loaded, both barrels as it always was, and unlatched the door. The cold came through immediately, a wall of it, stealing the heat from the small space behind her in seconds. She held the door with her shoulder and brought the lantern up with her free hand and looked. There were 2 of them on her porch. The man was tall, or had been. He was bent considerably at the moment, hunched against the wind, and the way he was holding himself suggested the hunch was not entirely voluntary. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, with dark hair plastered against his forehead by snow and sweat, a jaw that needed several days' attention from a razor, and an expression that had moved past desperation into a kind of stripped-bare steadiness, the look of a man who had burned through every other option and arrived at this one. His coat was a heavy canvas rancher's coat, good quality but battered, and on the left side, just below the ribs, it was wet in a way that the snow didn't explain. He was holding a boy against his right side with his right arm. The boy was maybe 7, small and slight, his face half buried in the man's shoulder. He was wearing a coat that was not warm enough, and his hands, pressed flat against the man's chest, were red and shaking. Behind them, at the edge of the porch, she could just make out 2 horses standing close together with their heads down, steam rising off them despite the cold. The man looked at the shotgun first, then at her face. "I wouldn't be here if I had anywhere else to go," he said. His voice was rough, scraped out. "My boy's cold. I'm asking you to let him in. Just him, if that's how it has to be." Evelyn looked at the boy. The boy lifted his head slightly and looked back at her with eyes that were watering from the cold and the wind, and he didn't say anything, and that was somehow worse than if he had. She stepped back from the door. Both of you, she said. Get in. Horses go in the lean-to left side of the barn. There's a bar on the inside of the door. The man hesitated for just a half second. She thought it was surprise. And then he moved, carefully, getting the boy inside first, then himself. Evelyn followed them out to the porch, pulled her coat tighter, and pointed toward the barn, which was barely visible through the snow. Can you walk to it? Yes. Go now, before they freeze. I'll get the boy warm. He handed the child to her with both arms. Not like someone surrendering something, more like someone placing something precious in a spot he'd calculated was safer than where he was standing. The boy came without protest, which said something about how tired he was. He was heavier than he looked, and cold, really cold, the kind of cold that had gotten into the core of him and not just the surface. Evelyn brought him inside and shut the door and put the shotgun back on its pegs, a decision she made consciously and not without some internal argument, and carried him to the chair nearest the stove. She opened the stove's damper and started feeding it from the wood box beside it, working fast, getting the fire up from the banked coals. "What's your name?" she asked. "Noah," the boy said. His teeth were chattering badly enough that it came out in 2 separate syllables. "Are you hurt anywhere, Noah?" He shook his head. "Just cold. Just cold is enough." She went and pulled one of the wool blankets off her bed and brought it back and wrapped it around him, tucking it under his feet. Then she put the coffee pot on. Then she went back and looked at him again. His color was coming up slowly, the blue tinge fading from his lips. He was watching her with a directness that most adults lost somewhere along the way. "Is your papa hurt?" she asked. Noah looked at the door. "He said it was nothing," the boy said. "He says that about everything." Evelyn went to the window and looked toward the barn. The lantern she'd left on the porch was barely visible through the snow. She waited. After 4 or 5 minutes that felt considerably longer, a dark shape moved across the yard and mounted the porch steps, and the door opened, and the man came back in, already moving to close it quickly behind him against the cold. He stood just inside the door and looked at the boy first, and the thing that crossed his face when he saw Noah, wrapped in the blanket by the warm stove, was not relief exactly. It was something quieter and more fundamental than relief. It was the look of a man who'd been running on nothing but necessity for hours and had just been given permission to stop for a moment. "Horses are in," he said. "I rubbed them down with some sacking I found. I hope that's all right." "It's fine," she pointed at the other chair, the one across from Noah. "Sit down." "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine. Sit down." He sat. And when he did, the hitch in his movement, the almost imperceptible way he favored his left side, was impossible to miss. "Take the coat off," Evelyn said. "Ma'am, You're bleeding through it. I can see it from here. Take it off, or I'll cut it off, and I'd rather not ruin a coat that's probably still serviceable." A long pause. The man glanced at Noah, who was watching this exchange with the focused attention of a child who has learned to read adult situations carefully. Then he started working the buttons. He was right that the coat was still serviceable. It was a good coat, whoever had made it, though it had been repaired in several places with different thread, and the lining was worn smooth. He peeled it back and she could see the dark stain spreading across the left side of his shirt, and when she moved the lamp closer she could see where it was coming from. A gash about 3 inches long, just below his bottom rib. Not deep enough to be immediately fatal, but deep enough, and it had been bleeding for a while. "What happened?" she said. "Branch," he said. "In the dark. We were pushing through a stand of timber and a broken branch hit me." She looked at the wound, and then at his face. "A branch did that?" "Yes." She looked at it again. The cut was clean on one edge and ragged on the other, which was not inconsistent with a broken branch, technically. She decided not to press it. Whatever had happened in the dark out there in the storm, he was here now and the wound needed tending, and the why of it could wait. "I need to clean that," she said. "It's going to hurt." "It already hurts." "It's going to hurt more." She went to the shelf above the dry sink and got the bottle of whiskey. Not something she drank from often, kept for exactly this kind of purpose, and the tin of salve her father had always kept on the same shelf, and a clean cloth from the stack by the washtub. She pulled the small table between the 2 chairs and set everything on it. She'd cleaned wounds before, her father's, her own, once a neighbor's boy who'd caught himself on a piece of machinery. She worked without flinching and without talking more than she needed to. And the man, he hadn't told her his name yet, held himself still with the focused effort of someone who has decided that making noise about pain is not something they're going to do in front of their child. "It needs stitching," she said when she'd gotten a good look. "Can you do that?" "I've done it before. Not on a person." He looked at her. "On a dog," she clarified. "And a goat." "That's reassuring. Take it or leave it. Harlan's crossing is 14 miles and the pass is closed." He took it. She had a proper sewing needle she kept for actual sewing and a card of strong thread, and she put the needle in the flame of the lamp for a minute and threaded it and did what needed doing. He made one sound, quiet and contained, at the first pass of the needle, and then nothing after that. The boy had turned his face away and was studying the wall with great concentration. When it was done, she wrapped a strip of clean cloth around his middle, making it firm but not tight enough to restrict his breathing. She tied it off and stepped back. "Thank you," the man said. The words came out plainly, without embellishment. Whatever he wasn't a man who performed gratitude. He just stated it. "What's your name?" Evelyn asked. "Caleb," he said. "Caleb Mercer." "Evelyn Hartwell. This is my land." She paused. "Not a welcome exactly, just information." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. "I understand." She poured coffee into 2 mugs and 1 tin cup for Noah and brought them to the table. Then she sat down across from him and studied him, the way she would have studied a piece of land or a piece of paper she was trying to get the measure of. He was a large man, but not a soft one. His hands were the hands of someone who'd worked outdoors for years, the knuckles enlarged, the palms calloused in specific patterns, the kind of weathering that came from actual labor rather than occasional effort. But there were contradictions. His speech had almost no regional accent, which was unusual out here. Most men in these parts carried the vowels and rhythms of wherever they'd grown up. His didn't. It was careful, controlled, the way people spoke when they'd spent years making sure they sounded a particular way. And his boots. She'd noticed them when he came in. Quality leather, well made, kept in better shape than the rest of his outfit suggested was typical. She filed these observations away without making anything of them yet. "How long have you been riding?" she asked. 2 days, maybe a little more." He looked at his coffee. "I lost track of the time sometime yesterday." "Where were you headed?" "West." A pause. "There's a town on the other side of the range. Millerton. I've got work there." Evelyn looked at Noah, who had pulled the blanket up around his shoulders and was drinking his coffee with careful, small sips, warming his hands on the tin cup. "You bring him with you everywhere?" "He comes with me," Caleb said, and the way he said it was not defensive, just settled, as if the arrangement was not open for discussion or re-examination and never had been. "His mother?" "Gone." She didn't ask for elaboration. You didn't out here. Gone meant gone, and it was its own complete sentence. "Pass won't clear for at least a week," she said. "Probably longer. I don't have room to put you up, but the barn's dry and there's enough hay for your horses, and there's a corner where you can lay out bedrolls, and it won't be comfortable, but it'll be warmer than outside." Caleb set his mug down and looked at her steadily. "I can pay." "I didn't say you could pay. I said the barn's dry. Work off the stay if you want to be square about it. The fence on the north side needs repair, some other things." She stood up and took her mug to the dry sink. "I'm not running a charity, but I'm not going to put a child back out in a blizzard, either." She was facing away from him when she said it, rinsing out the mug with water from the pitcher. She didn't see his expression, but she heard the small exhale. Not quite a sigh, more like something that had been held for a long time being carefully set down. "Thank you," he said again. The same plain delivery. "Don't thank me yet," Evelyn said. "Winter up here has a way of making everyone miserable equally." Noah fell asleep in the chair by the stove before the coffee was finished. The blanket pulled up to his chin, his mouth slightly open, the particular total surrender sleep of an exhausted child. Caleb watched him for a moment and then looked back at Evelyn. He'll sleep anywhere once he's warm, he said. Always has. He can stay in front of the stove tonight. It'll be warmer than the barn. Caleb shook his head. I'd rather keep him close. Evelyn looked at him. He'll be safe here. I know. He said it without hesitation, which she noticed. I know he'll be safe. He stopped, started again. I don't sleep well unless I know where he is. She understood that, actually, not from experience with a child, but from experience with something you couldn't afford to lose. The constant low-level accounting of it. The way your mind kept returning to check, the way you might keep checking a pocket where you'd put something irreplaceable. All right, she said. The bedrolls are in the barn. Come back if either of you need anything in the night. She paused at the door that led to her bedroom. And Mercer. He looked up. If you're still bleeding through that rap by morning, come and tell me. Not being a hero about it isn't weakness. It's just math. He nodded once. She went to bed. In the morning, the storm was still there, though it had shifted from its violent night peak into a steadier, grimmer presence. Heavy snow falling straight down now, no wind behind it, the kind that accumulated fast and quiet. Evelyn woke before first light, dressed in the cold, and built the fire up before she did anything else. She stood in the kitchen, looking out at the yard, which had been thoroughly transformed. The fence was completely buried. The lane out to the road was invisible. Even the barn, 60 feet away, was half hidden behind a curtain of white. She heard the barn door before she saw it open, a scrape and a thump. And then Caleb came across the yard carrying Noah on his back, the boy awake now and watching the falling snow over his father's shoulder, with the expression of someone encountering a brand new problem they haven't formed an opinion about yet. They came in stamping snow off their boots, and the boy helped without being asked, pulling off his own coat and hanging it on the peg beside his father's, and Evelyn noticed that too, the automatic competence of a child who'd been doing things for himself for a while. Horses? She asked. Fed and watered, Caleb said. Found the oat bin. I used some. I'll replace it. When the pass opens. Yes. She made porridge. It was plain, cornmeal and water with a small amount of salt, and she made enough for 3 without remarking on it. They ate at the table, the 3 of them, which was an arrangement Evelyn couldn't remember the last time she'd experienced in this room. It felt strange and not entirely unpleasant, which in itself felt strange. Noah ate carefully and completely, which was the sign of a child who'd learned not to waste food. He watched Evelyn with those steady eyes, and after a while he said, Do you have any animals? 2 chickens, Evelyn said. They're in the barn. What are their names? They're chickens. Noah considered this. My papa doesn't name things either, he said, not as a criticism, just as an observation. He says it makes it harder when they're gone. Evelyn glanced at Caleb, who had the look of a man who regretted certain conversations he'd had in the past. Your papa's probably right, she said. I call them Monday and Tuesday anyway, Noah said. In my head. Then I suppose they have names, Evelyn said. After breakfast, Caleb went out to start on the fence. Evelyn watched him from the window for a moment. He'd found tools without being directed to them, which meant he'd looked around the barn properly and paid attention to what he'd found. He was digging down through the snow to find the base of a post that had heeled over, working steadily, compensating slightly for his left side but not letting it stop him. She told herself she was watching because she wanted to see if he actually knew what he was doing. She was mostly honest with herself about most things. She wasn't completely honest about that one. Noah stayed inside. He was a self-sufficient child. He found a piece of charcoal and the back of an old flour sack and drew for a while at the table. Horses, mostly, drawn with a confidence that suggested he'd done a lot of it. He didn't chatter or demand attention. He existed in the space with a quietness that was not quite shyness and not quite reserve, but something that felt more like consideration, as if he'd learned to take stock of where he was before he decided how much of himself to put into it. At some point, he looked up from his drawing and said, What happened to your fence? Ice heaved the post last winter, Evelyn said. She was at the dry sink making a small repair to the handle of a pot. Should have fixed it in the fall. Why didn't you? Other things to do. He went back to his drawing. A minute later. Do you live here alone? Yes? Aren't you lonely? It was the kind of question only a child or a very close friend could ask without it being an intrusion. Evelyn set down the pot handle and thought about a true answer. Sometimes, she said. Mostly, I'm busy. Noah nodded as if this made complete sense to him and went back to his horses. By midday, the snow had lightened to occasional flurries and the world outside had gone very quiet. Evelyn took food out to Caleb at noon, bread, the last of it, and more coffee, and found him 3 posts in, the broken fence boards pulled and stacked neatly to one side. You know what you're doing? She said. I fixed a lot of fences, he said, without elaborating. She handed him the bread and the coffee and watched him eat, standing in the snow, looking out at what he'd done that morning. There was a competence to him that went beyond being handy. He'd worked the job the right way, not the fast way, checking the alignment of the posts before he set them, not just guessing. It was the approach of someone who'd been taught to do things properly, or who'd worked long enough with people who did things properly that it had become his standard without his necessarily thinking about it. Where are you from? She asked. East, he said. That's a lot of ground. It is. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the fence. There was something deliberate in his vagueness that she was beginning to identify as a pattern rather than coincidence. He answered questions the way you might navigate around a hole in the ice, politely, carefully, giving you something that wasn't quite nothing, but wasn't quite something either. She'd met men like that before. Men with histories they carried quietly, the weight of it distributed evenly enough that you couldn't see it, but present in every movement. Well, she said, I won't push. He looked at her then. I appreciate that. I'm not doing it for your benefit, she said. I've got enough history of my own that I don't need to borrow anyone else's. She walked back to the cabin and left him with his coffee and his fence. The first 3 days settled into something Evelyn hadn't expected. Not comfort, exactly, but a kind of workable rhythm. Caleb worked from first light until the light failed, methodical and thorough. He finished the fence and moved on without being asked to the gap in the barn roof where weather had been getting in for 2 seasons, then to the woodpile, which he brought up from adequate to genuinely well-stocked in a day and a half of serious splitting. He asked before he used anything, which she appreciated. He didn't fill silence with talk just to fill it, which she appreciated more. And he managed the particular trick, which most men she'd encountered in her adult life had not managed, of being present in a space without making that space feel smaller. At night, he and Noah went to the barn, even when Evelyn suggested they might as well use the main room for warmth. He refused pleasantly but consistently, and she came to understand that it wasn't stubbornness, it was propriety. He was in her space on her terms, and he was going to make sure the terms stayed clear. She found herself respecting it. Noah had taken to following her around at certain hours, not underfoot, just present, watching what she did with the focused interest of a child who thinks most things adults do are potentially interesting. He watched her mend a harness. He watched her sort seeds for the spring. He watched her do the small, constant accounting of a working homestead, and once, after watching her write in her notebook, the column of numbers that told her where she stood financially, he said, My papa does that too. Does what? Counts things. At night. When he thinks I'm asleep. Evelyn looked at him. Most people have things to count. He looks sad when he does it. She didn't answer that. She closed the notebook and set it aside. On the 4th evening, when the temperature had dropped hard, and the 3 of them were inside together after dinner, because the cold was genuinely vicious, and even Caleb had conceded the barn was not the ideal place to spend the night, they sat around the stove and Noah fell asleep early, curled in the chair with Evelyn's quilt over him, and the 2 adults sat in the kind of quiet that happens when there's nothing to do and nowhere to be and you've run out of practical things to talk about. Caleb said, after a while, Your father built this place. It wasn't a question. He'd been looking at the walls, the way the logs were fitted, the style of the work. 40 years ago, she said. Good work. He was a good builder. He wasn't always a good man, but he was a good builder. She hadn't meant to say that. It came out with the ease of something that had been in her head for years without ever quite getting said out loud. Caleb looked at her. He didn't push. He just waited, the way he did things, without pressure. He was better to me than he was to my mother, she said. I think he knew that by the end. He tried to make it up to me somehow, teaching me things, leaving me this place. She paused, leaving me the debt along with it. How bad is the debt? Manageable, she said. In a good year. This has not been a sequence of good years. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire through the stove's iron grate. I'm sorry, he said. That's a hard thing to carry alone. Everything up here gets carried alone. It doesn't have to. She looked at him then. He was looking at the fire, not at her, and he said it simply, not as a suggestion or an invitation, just as a statement about the world that he seemed genuinely to believe. The wind picked up outside again. The stove ticked. Noah made a small sound in his sleep and turned over without waking. Evelyn thought about all the things she could say in response to that. She thought about the various ways a woman alone on a mountain learned to hold things at arm's length, and the very specific reasons she'd gotten good at that particular skill. She thought about what it cost to believe that something difficult didn't have to be carried alone, and what it cost when that turned out to be wrong. She said nothing. But she didn't get up from her chair and end the evening either. She sat, and the fire burned, and the storm moved on in the dark outside, and the cabin held them all, the way it had held other difficult winters, patient and thick-walled and still standing. By the 6th day, the snow had stopped falling, but the cold had not relented, and Evelyn had arrived at a particular state of domestic adjustment that she hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely sure how to feel about. It was the small things, mostly. The way the coffee pot was already on when she woke up now, because Caleb rose before her and had taken to starting it without comment, as if he'd simply noted that it was a task that needed doing and done it. The way Noah had migrated, gradually and without anyone directing him to, from the barn corner to the main room, where he slept on a folded blanket by the stove, and was so quiet about it that the transition had happened across 2 days before Evelyn quite registered it as a change in arrangement. The way the barn had been reorganized, not dramatically, not in a way that imposed anything, but in the small logical adjustments of someone who had looked at a space and seen how it could work better, and then made it work better, stacking the remaining hay more efficiently, hanging the harness where it could dry properly rather than where it had been piled. She hadn't asked for any of it. That was the part that kept catching her off guard. She'd been alone long enough that she'd built every system and arrangement around the assumption of alone, and having 2 people exist in that arrangement without breaking it was something she hadn't thought was possible. She found herself watching Caleb more than she wanted to admit, not for reasons she'd have had trouble defending to herself. She watched him the way she watched anything she hadn't figured out yet, with the particular focused attention her father had called her second-best quality, after stubbornness. There were pieces of him that didn't fit, and they nagged at her the way a loose board nags at your foot. Not painful exactly, just there, every time you crossed that particular patch of floor. The way he moved, for one thing. She'd worked alongside enough men to know that physical labor left marks on a person's body that were specific to the labor. A man who'd spent years driving cattle moved differently than a man who'd spent years working timber. And both of them moved differently than a man who'd done most of his work in other kinds of rooms. Caleb's body had the endurance of someone accustomed to outdoor work, and his hands had the evidence of it. But there was something else in the way he held himself that didn't quite match. A kind of posture that wasn't quite the posture of a ranch hand. Too deliberate, like a man maintaining a way of standing rather than a man who'd simply always stood that way. His horses, too. She'd gotten a better look at them once the storm broke and she could move around the barn properly. 2 geldings, both well-bred, with good bone and clean lines. The kind of horses that cost real money and were maintained to a standard that went beyond what a wandering ranch hand would typically spend on an animal. The saddles were plain, worn down to nondescriptness, but the fittings were quality. The kind of quality you bought once because you could afford to buy the best and never needed to buy again. And there was the matter of how Noah read. On the 7th evening, Evelyn had produced the 3 novels from the shelf because Noah had run out of things to look at and had been working through the same flour sack drawing for 2 days. She offered him the books without expecting much. The boy was 7, and the books were adult, the kind of dense 19th century narratives that required patience and a certain tolerance for long descriptive passages. Noah had taken the top one, opened it, and started reading, not sounding out words. Reading. At a pace that was not the labored pace of a child still learning, but the steady, comfortable pace of someone for whom books were a familiar environment. She hadn't said anything, but she'd watched Caleb from across the table, and she'd seen the small tension in his jaw. Not much, barely anything. As he registered that she'd noticed, she let it lie. She was good at letting things lie until the right moment. The right moment came without warning, the way things usually did. It was the 9th day of their enforced cohabitation, and Evelyn had driven the wagon into the near pasture to check on a section of fence on the property's southern edge. The storm had been hard enough that she wanted to know what else might need attention before the ground got any harder. She left Noah drawing at the table and told Caleb where she was going, and he'd said he'd come along and she'd said she didn't need help, and he'd come anyway, which she found irritating, and then found she'd moved past irritating into something she was less certain how to categorize. They drove out in the wagon without much conversation. The snow was knee-deep in the fields, crusted on top, the surface throwing back the late morning light in a way that made your eyes ache after a while. The fence line on the south edge was mostly intact, 2 posts gone, which was better than she'd expected. On the way back, crossing the open middle of the pasture, she said without looking at him, "His mother was educated." Caleb said nothing. "Noah. He reads the way children read when they've been taught properly, early, with books in the house." She kept her eyes on the horses. "Not the way children read when their father's been teaching them when he gets a chance." The silence lasted long enough that she thought he wasn't going to respond at all. "His mother was a school teacher," Caleb said finally. Evelyn nodded. That fit. "She kept a library, even when we couldn't—" He stopped. Started differently. She believed in keeping books around. Noah grew up in a room with more books than furniture. The horses moved through the snow at their steady walk, breath rising in white clouds. Evelyn said nothing, giving him the space to either continue or not. He continued. "She died 3 years ago," he said. "November. There was a fever that went through. A lot of people got sick." He was looking straight ahead. "She got sick too fast. By the time it was clear how bad it was, there wasn't anything to be done." "I'm sorry," Evelyn said. "Noah was 4. He remembers her, but not really. He remembers the idea of her more than the actual her, I think." He said it without self-pity, just the careful wording of a man who'd thought about this particular grief for a long time and arrived at the most accurate description he could. "He asks about her sometimes, and I tell him what I can." "What was her name?" "Clara." A pause. "She was—" He stopped again, shook his head slightly as if whatever he'd been about to say was too large for the current occasion. "She was a good woman." They rode the rest of the way back to the barn without speaking. It wasn't uncomfortable, the silence. It had the quality of a silence after something real has been said, settled rather than empty. What Evelyn did not say, what she turned over in her mind while she unhitched the horses and Caleb lifted down the tools from the wagon bed, was that nothing he'd told her explained the horses. It didn't explain the boots, or the speech patterns, or the way he'd looked at her accounts ledger. That one time she'd left it on the table and he thought she wasn't looking. Not the look of a man glancing at someone's private papers, but the look of a man who understood exactly what he was seeing. She was going to need more than November, she thought, and a school teacher named Clara. But she didn't push. Not yet. The pass road opened on the 12th day, or began to open. Someone had come through with a team and a plow blade and broken the worst of the drifts on the lower section, which meant the road to Harlan's Crossing was passable, if not comfortable. Evelyn knew this because old Bertram Hoyle, who ran the nearest neighboring property 4 miles east, came through in his sled to check on her, as he did after every major storm, with a bottle of cider vinegar he knew she used for preserving and the particular face of a man delivering news he wasn't certain how to deliver. He saw Caleb in the yard when he drove up. Bertram was 63 and had been ranching this valley for 40 years, and had the conversational subtlety of a man who'd spent most of those years talking mainly to cattle. He pulled up his sled, looked at Caleb, looked at Evelyn, looked back at Caleb, and said, "You got company." "We had a storm," Evelyn said. "These two came through it. They're heading to Millerton." Bertram took this in. He handed her the cider vinegar. Pass is coming clear. Should be able to get a wagon through by end of week. He looked at Caleb again with the straightforward assessment of a man who has decided curiosity is more efficient than politeness. You a rancher? Among other things, Caleb said. Heading to Millerton for work? Yes. Bertram nodded slowly. He had the look of a man filing information without quite deciding what to do with it yet. He looked back at Evelyn. You need anything before the road opens proper? I'm fine, Bertram. He gathered his reins. Then, as if remembering it, Garrett Voss is back in the valley. Came through town last week with 2 men from Billings. People are saying the railroad's moving forward on the western extension. Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. Not panic, but the cold, tight precursor to it. Which line? The Northern Pacific Secondary. Bertram's voice was careful now. If they run it where the survey suggested, it cuts through the eastern edge of your property. I know where it cuts, she said. Voss has been buying up land on both sides of the proposed right-of-way, paying cash. Some people are taking it. Good for them. Bertram looked at her with the tired affection of a man who'd watched her be stubborn for 4 years and hadn't yet found a version of concern that she'd receive. Evelyn, if Voss gets the parcels on either side of yours, the legal pressure is going to be considerable. My land is my land. Your land has a note on it. She kept her face still. She was aware of Caleb standing 20 feet away, not visibly attending to the conversation, but in the open air on a quiet morning, there was no such thing as private. I know what's on my land, she said. Thank you for the vinegar, Bertram. He took the hint finally and drove off. She stood watching the sled until it was out of sight, then turned back to the yard. Caleb had gone back to what he'd been doing, tightening the wire on a section of fence he'd reset, and was not looking at her. She went inside. She sat at the table and opened the ledger and did arithmetic she'd done many times before, arriving at the same answer she always arrived at, which was that the numbers were manageable in a good year, which this was not, and that if Garrett Voss was assembling land on both sides of her property with cash from Billings' money, the bank that held her note was going to start receiving pressure that had nothing to do with her creditworthiness. She knew Garrett Voss by reputation and by one direct encounter, which had been enough. He was 45, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of sustained sociability that never quite reached his eyes. A man who'd learned very early that friendliness was a tool and had used it so consistently that most people forgot it was a tool and took it for the real thing. He'd inherited his father's ranch 12 years ago and had spent the intervening years making it considerably larger by methods that were legal, strictly speaking, and not anything else. She was still sitting at the table, not doing anything useful with the ledger, when Caleb came in. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He'd developed the habit of pausing there, not crossing into her space without a moment's notice. And she looked up at him. You heard that, she said. It wasn't a question. Some of it. Voss is going to try to take my land. Caleb came in and sat down across from her. He looked at her directly, the way he had looked at her the first night, before she'd done the stitching, before she'd known his name. The same quality of attention, stripped of performance. Tell me what you know about him. So she did. She told him about Garrett Voss and the 6 properties he'd absorbed in the past 8 years, 3 of them from widows, 2 from ranchers who'd had bad seasons and needed cash. 1 from a man who'd made the mistake of letting his taxes go delinquent. She told him about the railroad survey and the right-of-way and the way a secondary line changing its route by 2 miles could make a piece of land worth twice what it had been the week before or half. She told him about the bank in Billings and the note on her property and the number that note represented. Caleb listened without interrupting, which was something she'd noticed about him. He was a man who actually listened, who let you finish, who didn't start assembling his response while you were still talking. When she was done, he said, How long have you been holding this alone? 4 years. Since your father died? Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, is there anyone in town who'd back you publicly if it came to a legal fight? She considered that. Bertram Hoyle. Maybe 2 or 3 others who've had their own run-ins with Voss. But legal fights cost money, and the people who'd side with me are the same people who don't have much of it. What about a lawyer? There's one in Harlan's Crossing, Tom Alcott. He's decent enough. She paused. But Voss would hire someone from Billings, or Helena. Money buys weight in a courtroom like it buys weight everywhere else. Caleb nodded slowly, looking at the table. There was something working in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Not the blankness of someone who had nothing to say, but the more controlled stillness of someone deciding how much of what they're thinking to say out loud. You should get your deed checked, he said. The original language. Sometimes there are easement provisions or boundary descriptions that can be used either way, to support a forced sale or to prevent one. She looked at him. That's specific advice. It's common sense. It's the kind of common sense that comes from knowing something about property law. He met her gaze without flinching. I've been around people who dealt with land disputes, he said. What kind of people? The kind with land. She held his look for a moment. He didn't look away, and he didn't elaborate, and she was left once again with the sensation of understanding a man's outline, but not his interior, seeing exactly where the edges were without being able to see what was behind them. She decided to leave it there for now. She had more immediate things to worry about. That afternoon, she found Noah in the barn, not doing anything he shouldn't have been. He was sitting on a hay bale with Caleb's saddlebag open beside him, and he was carefully folding a piece of paper that had been tucked into an outer pocket. He looked up when Evelyn came in, and his expression was not guilty exactly, but it had the quality of a child who knows he's been found in the middle of something. I wasn't snooping, he said immediately. I didn't say you were. It fell out when I sat down. He held up the paper, which wasn't actually paper. It was a document of some kind, folded into quarters, with a look of something that had been handled many times. Papa carries this everywhere. He showed it to me once. It's about me. Evelyn kept her distance. Whatever it wasn't hers to look at. Then put it back. I know what it says. Noah folded it again carefully, precisely, the folds going exactly where they'd been before. It's a legal paper with my name on it. It says if something happens to my papa, I'm supposed to go to an address in Denver, to people I've never met. He tucked the document back into the pocket and pressed the flap closed. My papa said it's just in case, Noah said, but he made me memorize the address anyway. He looked at his hands. He makes me memorize a lot of things, just in case. Evelyn sat down on the hay bale at the other end, far enough away that it wasn't crowding him. And does that worry you? The just in cases? Noah thought about it with the seriousness he brought to most questions. Sometimes. Mostly I think if he's worried about something, he's got a reason to be worried, and I should pay attention. He looked at the saddlebag. We didn't always move around this much. We had a place. A real place. And then one day we didn't, and he said we were going west, and that was 2 years ago. 2 years of moving. Evelyn looked at the boy and thought about what that did to a child. Not in a pitying way, because Noah clearly hadn't been broken by it, but in the practical way she thought about most things. 2 years of learning new places and leaving them. 2 years of waking up and the world being a different shape than it had been. Do you miss it? She asked. The real place. I miss some things about it, Noah said. There was a tree, really big. I had a rope swing on it. He paused. And there was a woman who cooked for us, Mrs. Aldrich. She made bread every morning, the good kind. He said it without self-pity, just cataloging. Papa misses it too. He just doesn't say so. How do you know? Because sometimes when he thinks I'm asleep, he sits and doesn't do anything. He just sits. Noah looked at her with his clear, steady eyes. That's what missing things looks like, when you're too tired to keep pushing it down. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. You're a very observant kid, she said. Papa says that too. Noah slid off the hay bale. He says it like it worries him a little. He went off toward the cabin, and Evelyn sat in the barn a moment longer, listening to the horses shift and breathe in their stalls, thinking about a big tree and a rope swing and Mrs. Aldrich's bread, and a man who sat and did nothing when he thought no one was watching. Caleb found the weakness in the roof over the hay storage 3 days before the pass road was declared fully open. He didn't say anything about it at first. Evelyn noticed him looking at it from below, tipping his head at a particular angle, And then later she heard him up there, moving carefully on the old boards, testing what he found. He came down and told her straight. 3 of the support beams were rotted through, and the boards above them weren't far behind. One heavy snow load, which, in Montana, was not a hypothetical, and that section of roof came down onto the hay, which meant wet hay, which meant mold, which meant a feed problem come spring. "How bad is the repair?" she asked. "Material's the cost," he said. "The work I can do." He looked at the barn roof, calculating. "You'd need timber, the right size. Probably have to get it from Harlan's Crossing. That means a trip to town." "Yes." She looked at him. He looked back. They both knew what a trip to Harlan's Crossing meant, with the pass newly open, and Garrett Voss freshly arrived with men from Billings. "I'll go," she said. "I could go. It's my property and my account at the mill. I'll go." She paused. "You can come if you want." He came. Noah stayed with the horses, an arrangement he accepted with better grace than Evelyn expected. She'd offered him the job of feeding Monday and Tuesday, the chickens, and he'd taken it with the seriousness of a child who'd been given actual responsibility and intended to honor it. The drive to Harlan's Crossing took 2 hours on the now passable road, the wagon following the ruts left by the plow team, the horses moving steadily in the cold. The mountains on either side were sharp and white and enormous against the pale sky, and the world had the scoured clarity that came after big winter weather. Everything simplified, every edge visible. Harlan's Crossing was not a large town, but it had what it needed: a mill, a bank, a dry goods store, a saloon that doubled as the de facto meeting hall, a small doctor's office above the land agents, and the particular social architecture of a place where everyone knew everyone and newcomers were assessed comprehensively within 24 hours of arrival. Evelyn had a list. She went to the mill first and ordered the timber and arranged delivery for the following week, paying with the small reserve she kept separate from the operating money, the one she'd been building for 2 years for exactly this kind of unplanned need. Then the dry goods for the supplies she was running low on. She was coming out of the dry goods with 2 sacks, and Caleb was carrying the 3rd when she saw the horses outside the saloon. 3 of them. Good horses, not working animals. One of them a gray that she recognized. She'd seen it once before, 2 summers ago, tied outside the land agent's office. She stopped walking. Caleb, 1 step behind her, stopped too. "You know that horse," he said. He'd been watching her face. "It belongs to Garrett Voss." A beat of silence. Then, from behind them, a voice. "Evelyn Hartwell." It was smooth and warm, the voice of a man who'd had a lot of practice making his voice smooth and warm. "I was just thinking about you." Garrett Voss came off the saloon steps with his hands in his coat pockets and his hat pushed back on his head at an angle that was studied enough to look casual. He was a big man, not tall, but broad and solid, with the confidence of someone who'd spent enough years being the largest presence in any room that he'd stopped having to think about it. He had a salesman's face, handsome in the broad, immediate way that worked at a distance and got more complicated the closer you looked. 2 men came off the steps behind him and stayed there, not doing anything, just present. "Mr. Voss," Evelyn said. Her voice came out level, which she was glad for. His eyes went to Caleb. Something moved across his face. Not recognition, but something adjacent to it. The calibrated attention of a man assessing a potential factor. "Who's your friend?" he said. "Caleb Mercer," Caleb said. He said it himself, before Evelyn could answer, and he said it without inflection, without offering anything else, the way you'd offer a minimal fact to a question you found mildly presumptuous. Voss looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he looked back at Evelyn with the practiced smile back in place. "I've been hoping to sit down with you, Evelyn, about the property." "I'm not interested in sitting down." "Now, I understand that. I do. But the railroad situation is moving faster than people expected, and I want to make sure you have all the information before things get formal." He spread his hands, the picture of reasonableness. "I'd hate for you to end up on the wrong side of a legal process when a simple conversation could have prevented it." "Is that a threat, Garrett?" "It's concern," he said, and he almost made it sound like it was. The 2 men on the steps hadn't moved. A couple of people on the street had slowed, registering the configuration without appearing to look directly at it. "My land is my land," Evelyn said. "The deed is clear and the boundary is surveyed. If the railroad wants an easement, they can apply for one like anyone else." "They will," Voss said. "The question is whether you have the resources to contest it when they do." He let that settle for a moment, and then he added gently, "And we both know what's on that land, Evelyn. What's owed on it." She held his gaze and didn't answer, because the answer was complicated, and this was not the place for complicated answers. Voss looked at Caleb one more time. That same assessing quality, sharper now, more deliberate, as if he were trying to place him in failing and finding that failure more interesting than a successful identification would have been. "Think about what I said," Voss told Evelyn. "I'll be in the valley through the week." He touched his hat brim and went back up the steps and into the saloon, and the two men followed him, and the street exhaled. Evelyn turned and walked to the wagon and loaded the sacks without speaking. Caleb helped her, and also said nothing. They got up onto the seat, and she gathered the reins and turned the horses back toward the road. They were a quarter-mile out of town before either of them said anything. "He looked at you like he was trying to remember something," Evelyn said. "I noticed." "Do you know him?" "No?" She waited. "I know people like him," Caleb said. "Men who buy things before the people who own them understand what they're selling." It was a careful answer. She recognized it as such and filed it alongside all the other careful answers, the accumulating weight of them, the pattern she was beginning to understand without yet being able to name. The mountains rose around them, and the road unrolled ahead, and Evelyn drove home thinking about a gray horse outside a saloon, and a man from Billings with warm eyes and a cold purpose, and the fact that the person sitting beside her on this wagon seat knew something he wasn't saying, and that whatever it was not small. The timber arrived on a Thursday, hauled up from Harlan's Crossing on a flatbed by the mill's delivery man, who left it stacked in the yard with the efficiency of someone who had other stops to make and no interest in conversation. Caleb had the old roof boards off the hay section before the wagon was back on the road. Working from a scaffold he'd built out of spare lumber with the focused economy of someone who'd done this kind of thing before and wasn't interested in doing it twice. Evelyn worked alongside him. She'd expected him to suggest she do something else, the way most men would have, and he hadn't, and she'd taken that as permission to simply show up with the tools and start. They worked well together in the way that people work well together when neither of them needs to prove anything to the other, passing materials without being asked, reading what the job needed next, staying out of each other's way in the physical sense while remaining close enough to work efficiently. Noah handed up boards from below when they needed them, which he did with a seriousness that was almost comic in someone his size, small hands gripping the lumber with total concentration, making sure the board went up straight. "Good," Caleb told him, the second time he handed one up. Noah's face did something careful and pleased that he tried to keep controlled, and didn't quite succeed. They had the new beams in by midday, and the boards laid over them by mid-afternoon. Caleb was nailing down the last section when the cold came back hard, the temperature dropping 20 degrees in the space of an hour, the way it did in Montana in late winter. A reminder that the season wasn't finished regardless of what the calendar suggested. By the time they came off the scaffold, the sky was iron-colored, and the wind had a bite to it that made your eyes water. Inside, over supper, Evelyn watched Caleb and tried to work out what to do with the accumulation of things she'd noticed and filed and not yet addressed. The encounter with Voss in town had been sitting in her chest like a splinter she could feel, but couldn't locate precisely enough to extract. Not painful, but present. Constant. The way Voss had looked at Caleb. The way Caleb had said his own name in response, offering it with a flatness that wasn't the flatness of someone with nothing to hide, but the flatness of someone who'd rehearsed the offering. She'd been patient. She was good at patient, but patience had its own arithmetic, and she was approaching the end of what the numbers allowed. After Noah had fallen asleep, he went down early these days, worn out by the physical days, which Evelyn thought was probably the best thing for him. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Caleb and sat down and said, without any particular lead-up, "Tell me who you actually are." He looked at the coffee cup. "I told you who I am." "You told me a name and a direction and a dead wife and a job in Millerton," she said. None of that adds up to the horses or the boots or the way you looked at my deed when you thought I wasn't watching or the fact that my 7-year-old neighbor can read better than most adults I know. She kept her voice even, not angry, factual. I've let it sit because it wasn't my business, and you weren't hurting anyone, and you've more than paid your way here. But Garrett Voss looked at you in that street like he was trying to place a face he'd seen on a piece of paper, and whatever he was trying to remember, I think it has something to do with my land. Caleb sat very still. Outside, the wind pushed against the north wall. The stove ticked. I'm not asking to be difficult, she said. I'm asking because if there's something coming at this property that involves you, I need to know it before it arrives, not after. A long moment passed. She watched him work through something internal, not deciding whether to trust her exactly, more like deciding whether he was still in a position where keeping the thing hidden served any purpose. The look of a man who's been carrying a weight for a long time and is calculating whether setting it down will make things better or worse. He set it down. My name is Caleb Whitmore, he said. She waited. My father was Edmund Whitmore. He built the Whitmore Northern Railroad Company out of nothing over 30 years, starting in Ohio and working west. By the time he died, the company controlled 400 miles of line and had financial interests in another 200. He said it without pride, just inventory. He died 6 years ago. I was the eldest son. The company was supposed to come to me. Evelyn looked at him steadily. Supposed to. My younger brother Richard contested the inheritance. He had support from the board, who preferred him. Richard was better at the social end of it, the investor dinners, the political handshaking. I was better at the operational side, which mattered less to men who thought about railroads as financial instruments rather than actual machines that had to actually run. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. It became a legal dispute, a long one, and while it was going on, Clara got sick. He stopped, started again. I settled. I let Richard have the company and took a cash settlement and some land in Colorado and walked away. He looked up at her. I had a 4-year-old and a wife who was dying, and I did not have the capacity to fight a legal war and be present for what was happening in my own house at the same time. So I made a choice. And the cash? Gone. Most of it. Clara's illness was long. After she died, He stopped. I made some poor decisions. That's the honest version. I was not in a condition to make good ones for a while. Evelyn thought about what Noah had said in the barn. We had a place. A real place. And then one day we didn't. So you've been moving, she said. The settlement included some land in Colorado that I sold when I needed to, piece by piece. What's left is enough to start somewhere new, if I'm careful. He paused. There's work in Millerton. Real work, not because of my name. A man named Patterson is building up a freight operation, and he needs someone who understands how railroads and supply lines actually function. I reached out to him under the name Mercer. He doesn't know who I am. Does Garrett Voss know who you are? The question landed in the room and sat there. He might, Caleb said. He has connections to my brother's people. Richard he wasn't satisfied with just having the company. He wanted to make sure I stayed gone. He said it with a flatness that was not indifference, but the thing you arrived at after you'd been angry for long enough that the anger had worn down to something more durable. There were men who worked for Richard who would have told him if I was seen anywhere near a railroad interest. Voss is connected to the Northern Pacific secondary line. Yes. And your family company, the Whitmore Northern, feeds into the Northern Pacific main line at 2 junctions. He looked at her. If Richard's people tipped off Voss that I was in the area, Voss might be moving faster on the land acquisition than he planned. To close the deal before I can... He stopped. Before you can what? He was quiet for a moment. Before I can complicate it, he said, and she could hear in that careful phrasing that there was something more he wasn't ready to say yet. She sat back and looked at him. She was trying to organize what she now knew into something she could use, the way she'd organize a ledger page into something that showed her the actual picture. A man from a railroad family, hiding his name, 3 weeks into an accidental winter on her mountain, with a land baron from Billings suddenly interested in her eastern fence line. You should have told me this earlier, she said. I know. Not because I would have thrown you out, she said, Because I might have been able to. She stopped. It doesn't matter now. What matters is what comes next. Caleb looked at her with something in his expression that she couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't gratitude, though it held a piece of that. It was more like the look of someone who'd expected a specific response and gotten a different one and hadn't finished adjusting to the difference. "You're not angry," he said. "I'm annoyed," she said precisely. "That's not the same thing." She stood up and took her coffee cup to the dry sink. "I'm going to sleep on this. In the morning, we need to talk about what to do before Voss comes up here, which he will." "Evelyn." She stopped. "I'm sorry," he said, "for not being straight with you. You gave us a door in a blizzard, and you didn't have to do that. And He stopped. "I should have trusted that sooner." She turned halfway. "You had a child to protect." "That's not all of it." She looked at him for a moment, at the honest discomfort of a man who is making himself say the true thing rather than the defensible thing. "No," she said. "I know it's not. Get some rest." She went to bed. She lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the wind, not sleeping, running calculations of a different kind than the usual arithmetic. In the morning, she found Noah outside alone, which was unusual. He was sitting on the porch steps in his coat, watching a magpie pick at something in the snow near the fence. She came out with her coat half-buttoned and looked around the yard. "Where's your father?" Noah looked at her, and something crossed his face that was the careful blankness of a child who's been told something and is trying to decide what to do with it. "He went for a walk," Noah said, "before breakfast. He does sometimes when he's thinking about something." She looked out across the yard. The snow was unbroken except for a line of boot tracks heading south toward the ridge. She watched Noah's face for a moment. He was back to watching the magpie, but with the quality of attention that meant he was actually attending to something else. "Did he say how long?" "He said he'd be back." A pause. "He said to stay here." She went inside and put the coffee on and made breakfast for two, and she waited. She was not a woman who panicked easily, but she was also not a woman who pretended a thing wasn't happening when it clearly was. The tracks in the snow went toward the ridge, which was the direction away from the road, away from town, away from anything in particular except the high ground. She was 3 bites into her food when Noah came in from the porch, and she looked at his face, and she set her fork down. "What did he tell you?" she asked. Noah sat down. He folded his hands on the table the way his father did sometimes, the same gesture, and she had a sudden, unexpected sense of the boy he would become in 20 years. "He said we'd probably be moving on soon," Noah said. "He said things were getting complicated." He looked at his hands. "He said you'd been very kind to us." The word kind. Past tense. Something tightened in Evelyn's chest. Not grief, because grief required a loss that had finished happening, and this one was apparently still in process. Something more like the particular cold of watching something coming and not being in the right position to stop it. "What else?" "He said..." Noah stopped. "He said sometimes when you care about a place and the people in it, the right thing to do is leave before you make things harder for them." He looked up. "I didn't argue. He doesn't change his mind when I argue." He paused. "But I didn't agree either." "Good for you," Evelyn said, and meant it. She ate the rest of her breakfast and thought, and when she was done, she cleared the plates and put on her coat and told Noah to stay inside, and she followed the boot tracks south toward the ridge. She found Caleb on the high point where the ridge leveled briefly before dropping away to the south, standing in snow that came to his knees, looking out at the valley below. The whole valley was visible from up here on a clear day, and today was clear. She could see Harlan's Crossing as a cluster of dark shapes 8 miles away, and the white open stretches of other properties, and the road, and the distant dark line of the timber on the far ridge. She came up beside him and stood and looked at the same view. "You were going to leave without telling me," she said. "I was going to tell you." "When?" A pause. "When I'd worked out what to say." "Here's a suggestion," she said. "The truth. We've already established you can manage it when you try." He turned to look at her. He had the look of a man who'd come up here to think himself into a resolution and had arrived at one that he was not particularly happy with, but had accepted. Voss knows I'm here, or he will soon, and when he confirms it, he's going to use it. My presence on your property gives him a line of argument that you're harboring someone with a disputed railroad inheritance, that there's a financial motive, that your land is somehow connected to a business dispute. None of it has to be true to be effective. None of it is true. That's not the point. The point is what a man with Billings lawyers can do with a story, true or not, in a court where the bank holding your note is also making contributions to the judge's political campaigns. He looked back at the valley. If I leave, that line of argument disappears. You're just a woman with land and a debt and legal standing, and it's harder for him to muddy the water. She was quiet for a moment. And if you leave, she said, I'm fighting this without anyone who understands how these men operate, without anyone who knows what they're actually after and why. She let that sit. You have information I don't have. About the railroad, about Voss's connection to your brother, about what this land is actually worth to them and why they want it now. You can't use that information without revealing where it came from. Maybe I don't need to use it in a courtroom. Maybe I just need to use it here. She turned to face him directly. Garrett Voss came to this valley because someone told him you were here, which means your presence, your actual presence, not the story he can make out of it, is something he's trying to manage. That means you have leverage you haven't used yet. He looked at her. What kind of leverage? I don't know yet, but I know that the man who's been doing arithmetic in the dark because he has things to count, the man who settled a legal war to sit with his dying wife and has been trying to become someone else for 2 years, he hasn't finished the accounting yet. She held his gaze, and I think he knows it. The wind came across the ridge and moved the snow in small eddies around their boots. Caleb looked at her for a long time with the expression she'd come to recognize as his actual thinking face. Not the careful blankness, but the open, unsettled look of someone genuinely working something out in real time. If I stay, he said, things get harder before they get easier. Things are already hard, she said. I live on a mountain in Montana with a debt and a failing fence and chickens named Monday and Tuesday by a child I didn't know 3 weeks ago. Hard is not a new condition. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, the precursor to one. Monday and Tuesday, he said. He told you. He tells me everything eventually. He looked back toward the cabin, which was just visible from here, a dark shape against the snow, smoke rising from the chimney in a straight line in the still cold air. He likes it here, Caleb said. It came out quietly, not as information, but as something he was acknowledging to himself as much as to her. I know, she said. He hasn't liked a place in a long time. She didn't answer that. She let it exist without comment. The way you let a thing exist when adding words to it would only diminish it. They stood on the ridge for another minute, and then Evelyn turned and started back down toward the cabin, and after a moment she heard his footsteps in the snow behind her. Voss came 3 days later. She'd known he would. She'd spent those 3 days in a particular state of preparation that was less about physical readiness than mental, going over what she knew, what she could prove, what she was willing to say in front of whoever he brought with him. Caleb had stayed, and they'd talked, long conversations at the kitchen table in the evenings after Noah slept, going over the legal landscape with a thoroughness that Evelyn found both useful and painful, because the more thorough the accounting got, the clearer the shape of her situation became, and the shape was not good. The note on the property was the fulcrum. Voss didn't need to take her land directly. He needed to create enough legal and financial pressure that the bank in Billings found it expedient to call in the note, and then he needed to be the available buyer when the property went to forced sale. It was a clean mechanism if you had the connections to run it, and Garrett Voss had the connections. What complicated it, what might complicate it, if played right, was Caleb. Specifically what Caleb knew about the relationship between Voss's land acquisitions and the Whitmore Northern secondary line plans. Caleb had explained it in the flat, certain way he explained things when he was sure of what he was saying. His brother Richard needed the Northern Pacific secondary route to go through this particular valley to make a junction work at the point where the Whitmore Northern would eventually extend westward. The junction's value depended on controlling the land on the approach corridor. Voss was acting as Richard Whitmore's proxy, buying the approach corridor piece by piece. If the arrangement became public, specifically if it became public before the land was fully assembled, the Northern Pacific Board would have a problem because they'd publicly committed to a neutral right-of-way process. "It's not illegal," Caleb said. "It's just embarrassing. For both of them." "Embarrassing enough to stop it?" "Embarrassing enough to slow it. And slowing it buys time." He paused. "Time is what you need. Time to shore up the note, time to get legal counsel that isn't in Billings. How do I use it without revealing that you told me?" He'd been quiet on that for 2 days, and she'd watched him think, the way Noah had described, sitting, not doing anything, the internal work happening behind a still face. She hadn't pushed. He hadn't arrived at an answer by the time the sound of horses came up the lane on the third morning. Voss came with 2 men, the same 2 from the saloon steps, and a third she didn't recognize, younger, with the look of someone who carried papers rather than weapons, which in its own way was more concerning. They rode into the yard and Voss dismounted with the easy manner of a man arriving somewhere he was considering purchasing. Evelyn came out onto the porch. She hadn't called for Caleb, but she heard the barn door and knew he'd heard the horses. "Morning, Evelyn," Voss said, pulling off his gloves. "I was hoping we could talk inside. It's cold." "We can talk here," she said. He accepted that with a small nod, as if it were a perfectly reasonable preference that he respected completely. He came to the porch steps and stopped there, looking up at her with his warm eyes and his calibrated expression. "I've had some legal counsel look at your situation," he said, "with the property. I wanted to share what they found because I think it changes the picture somewhat. You hired lawyers to look at my land without my permission. Property records are public, Evelyn. Anyone can look." He said it gently, the way you correct a child's misunderstanding. The council's view is that given the existing note and the current land values in the valley, the bank would be well within its rights to request a reassessment of the collateral. And given the railroad interest, the assessed value might actually drop, because the right-of-way creates uncertainty about the land's utility. It was a clean argument. She'd known it was coming, and it was still unpleasant to hear it stated plainly. "However," Voss continued, "I'm in a position to offer you something that makes all of that moot. I'll take the property at a price that covers the note plus 12% above the current assessed value. You walk away clear, no legal fight, no bank pressure, no uncertainty." "No land," she said. "You'd have cash, which is more useful than mountain real estate when the railroad comes through and cuts the access." He was good at this. She gave him that. Every piece of his argument was positioned to sound like he was doing her a favor. Behind him, she heard the crunch of snow. Caleb had come across the yard and was standing at the edge of the porch. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. Voss turned. He looked at Caleb for a moment, and this time the look was different from the one in town. This time there was recognition in it, not complete, but closer. The face of a man who'd received a description and was now comparing it to the original. "Mr. Mercer," he said. "Voss?" Caleb said. A beat of silence. The young man with the papers looked between them. "You know," Voss said conversationally, "it's an interesting thing. I had a message come through from an associate in Denver. Apparently a man matching your description has been making inquiries about freight operations out west, under the name Mercer." He paused. "But my associate was fairly certain the man he knew as Caleb Whitmore had gone west sometime last year." There it was, out in the cold air, in the yard of Evelyn's father's cabin, laid out like cards on a table. Evelyn felt Caleb go still beside her, the particular stillness of someone who has reached the end of one road and is taking the first step onto another. He said nothing. His jaw was set and his eyes were steady, and he said absolutely nothing. Voss looked at Evelyn. "Did you know who was staying on your property, Evelyn? Because a Whitmore involvement in this land, any Whitmore, given the family's railroad interests, creates a very different legal picture than a simple debt situation. It raises questions about intent, about whether this property was being used as part of a business strategy." He said it regretfully, as if he genuinely wished the complications didn't exist. Questions that a bank holding a note would be very interested in. The threat was elegant. She had to admit that even as her hands tightened on the porch rail. He wasn't accusing anyone of anything specific. He was simply naming a question that, once named in the right rooms, would be impossible to unask. Evelyn looked at Caleb. Caleb was looking at Voss with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not anger, not fear. Something colder and more resolved. The look of a man who has been avoiding something for 2 years and has just decided, in this specific moment, on this specific porch, with the cold coming off the mountains and the smoke rising from the chimney, that he is done avoiding it. "You should leave," Caleb told Voss. "I don't think that's in anyone's interest. You should leave," he said again. Same tone, same volume. Not louder, not harder, just absolute. The kind of voice that doesn't waste energy on performance because it doesn't need to. Voss looked at him for a moment, then at Evelyn. Then he smiled, the warm professional smile, the one that didn't reach his eyes, and he put his gloves back on. "Think about the offer," he told Evelyn. "I'll be in Harlan's Crossing through the week." He mounted and rode out with his men, and the yard went quiet again, and Evelyn stood on the porch and watched them go, and the sound of the horses faded down the lane and was replaced by the wind and the creak of the pines. She looked at Caleb. "Well," she said, "I know. We need that lawyer." "We need something better than a lawyer in Harlan's Crossing," he said. He was looking at the lane where Voss had ridden out, and he was still in the grip of whatever had shifted in him in the last 5 minutes. "I need to make a decision I should have made a year ago." She waited. "There's something I can do," he said, "something that neutralizes Voss, but it means stopping hiding." He looked at her, the full weight of it visible in his face, not drama, just the actual cost of the thing he was describing. "It means being Caleb Whitmore again, in public, on record, and everything that comes with that." Noah had appeared in the doorway behind them at some point, and he was listening, and when Caleb turned and saw his son standing there, something moved through his face that was more complicated than any of the expressions she'd seen on it before. The whole of it, the 2 years of running and the things left unfinished, and the boy who'd memorized an address in Denver just in case, all of it in one look that lasted a second and then was gone. "Okay," Noah said from the doorway. His voice was careful and steady. "Do it." Caleb looked at his son for a long moment. Then he looked at Evelyn, and Evelyn thought about a door she'd opened in a blizzard and the arithmetic of what that door had let in, and she said, "Tell me what you need." What Caleb needed, it turned out, was a telegraph office in 2 days. Evelyn drove him to Harlan's Crossing the following morning, leaving Noah with specific instructions about the chickens and the water barrel and a firm directive to stay inside if anyone came up the lane. Noah accepted this with the seriousness he brought to most things and added, unprompted, that he would bar the door from the inside, which told Evelyn something about what the boy had internalized over 2 years of moving and just in cases. The telegraph office in Harlan's Crossing occupied a narrow room beside the post, run by a man named Decker, who was professionally incurious about the content of the messages he sent, a quality that made him valuable and well-liked in a town where people had reasons for things they preferred not to explain. Caleb went in alone. Evelyn waited with the wagon on the street and watched the door and did not ask what he was sending or to whom. He came out 12 minutes later with the look of a man who has dropped a stone into a well and is waiting to hear the bottom. "Now we wait," he said. "For what?" "For the right person to receive that message and decide what to do with it." She looked at him. "Are you going to tell me who the right person is?" "A man named Hargrove, Gerald Hargrove. He's on the Northern Pacific Board." He got up onto the wagon seat. "He and my father they had a long business relationship. He's one of the few people in that world who knew what happened between me and Richard and had the opinion that it was handled badly. Will he act on a telegraph from a man who's been calling himself Mercer for 2 years? I signed it Whitmore." He looked at his hands for a moment. "It was the first time I've written that name on anything in a long time." She turned the horses back toward the road. The morning was sharp and bright, the kind of winter day that was beautiful in direct proportion to how cold it was, the sky a hard blue above the white peaks. She drove and thought about a man writing his own name for the first time in 2 years and what that cost. They stopped at Tom Alcott's office on the way out of town. Alcott was a thin man in his 50s with an unhurried manner that Evelyn had always found reassuring and occasionally maddening, depending on the urgency of the situation. He listened to what she told him, the note, the Voss offer, the legal pressure she expected from Billings, with his hands folded on his desk and his eyes moving between her and Caleb. When she finished, he said, "The core of the threat is the note and the bank's relationship with Voss's people. If that relationship can be demonstrated as conflicted, the bank loses its ability to call the note without a proper process. How long does a proper process take? In Montana, with the right filing, 3 to 6 months minimum. And in 3 to 6 months?" Alcott looked at Caleb in a way that said he'd already understood more of the situation than Evelyn had fully explained. In 3 to 6 months, a number of things could change. He paused. "Mr. Mercer, or whoever you are. If there's something coming from outside this valley that changes the calculus on the railroad's right-of-way decisions, the timing of that matters considerably." "I understand that," Caleb said. "Then I'll file what needs to be filed today," Alcott said, and stood up and shook both their hands with the brisk efficiency of a man who has decided to be useful and is getting on with it. They drove home in the early afternoon, and Evelyn sat with the reins in her hands and thought about the various moving pieces of the situation, the way she thought about the ledger, trying to see the whole page at once rather than getting fixed on one column. 3 to 6 months. A telegraph to a board member in a city she'd never been to. A lawyer with enough competence to slow the mechanism, but not enough weight to stop it. It was not a comfortable set of numbers. But it was something. Listen. The reply came on the second day, which was faster than either of them had expected. Decker sent a boy up the mountain with it in the late afternoon, a kid of maybe 12 on a spotted horse who handed the envelope to Evelyn with the gravity of someone who'd been told the message was important and was taking that seriously. She tipped him a nickel, and he turned the horse and clattered back down the lane. She brought the envelope inside and set it on the table in front of Caleb without opening it. It was addressed to him, to Caleb Whitmore, care of the Harlan's Crossing Telegraph, in a handwriting that was precise and small, the handwriting of someone trained to compress information. He looked at it for a moment. Then he opened it. She watched his face while he read. It was a short message. The envelope was thin, not more than a page, and he read it twice, which told her it was either complex or he was making sure he'd understood it correctly the first time. He set it down. "Hargrove received my message," he said. "He's been aware for some months that Richard's people were working with Voss on the land assembly. He opposed it internally. He was outvoted." He looked at her. "He says if I'm willing to make a formal statement about what I know, specifically about the arrangement between Richard and Voss and the Northern Pacific route decision, he can bring it to the full board before the right-of-way is finalized." "A formal statement," she said, "meaning public. Meaning on record. Yes. What does that do to you, professionally, legally?" He folded the telegraph and set it flat on the table. "It reopens the question of the inheritance settlement. Richard's lawyers will argue the settlement was final. Mine, if I get some, will argue that Richard's conduct in leveraging a public railroad body for private land acquisition violates the terms under which I agreed to walk away." He paused. "It's not a sure thing. It's probably a long fight. But it stops Voss." "It stops Voss," he said. "The Northern Pacific can't finalize the right-of-way while the board is in active dispute about a conflict of interest. And without the right-of-way finalized, the land values in this corridor don't change. The bank has no reason to pressure anyone, and Voss's entire mechanism stalls." She sat across from him and looked at him directly. "And you've been avoiding this for 2 years because I was tired," he said. It came out simply, without apology. "I was tired and I had a 4-year-old, and I did not want to be Caleb Whitmore anymore. I did not want the name or the history or the legal machinery or any of it. I wanted—" He stopped. "I wanted what Clara would have wanted. Something quiet. Something real." He looked at his hands. Running from it didn't make it quiet. It just made it loud in a different way. Noah came in from outside at that moment with snow on his boots and a piece of wood he'd found that he thought looked like a horse, which it vaguely did, and he set it on the table and looked at his father's face and then at Evelyn's face and said, "Something happened." "Something is happening," Evelyn said. "It's not settled yet." Noah looked at his father. I'm going to do something I should have done before, Caleb said. It's going to be complicated for a while. More complicated than the last 2 years? Caleb looked at his son with the expression Evelyn had come to recognize as the one that got past his defenses, the one that was just a father looking at a child he loved more than he knew how to say. Probably about the same, he said, just in different directions. Noah considered this. He picked up his piece of wood. Okay, he said, and went to sit by the stove. And that was apparently that. Oh. The confrontation in town happened on a Friday, 4 days after the telegraph from Hargrove, and it was not planned. Evelyn had gone to Harlan's Crossing to file additional paperwork with Alcott, documents that Alcott said needed her signature in person. And Caleb had come because the situation had moved to a point where leaving her to navigate it alone felt wrong in a way he couldn't rationalize around anymore. They left Noah with Bertram Hoyle, who'd come up that morning on other business, and agreed to stay with the boy with the grumbling willingness of a man who found children exhausting and would do anything for them. They rode in on horseback because the wagon was slower and the day had a cold that promised weather by afternoon. Evelyn rode her mare and Caleb rode the better of his 2 geldings, and they made the trip in an hour and 40 minutes and tied up outside Alcott's office. The signing took 20 minutes. Alcott explained what each document said in his unhurried way, and Evelyn read each one herself, which Alcott had stopped seeming surprised by after the first time. When they were done, he stacked the papers and said, "These are filed before end of day. The bank in Billings receives notice by the end of the week. After that, any action on the note has to go through a formal process that I will make as slow as the law allows." "Thank you, Tom." "Don't thank me yet. Slow isn't stopped." He looked at Caleb. "Have you heard back from your contact?" "Hargrove is bringing the conflict of interest question to the board next Thursday. He needs a written statement from me before then." "Get it to me," Alcott said. "I can have it notarized and transmitted through proper channels, which gives it more weight than a private telegraph." They left Alcott's office at 11:30, and they would have ridden straight back home if Evelyn hadn't needed to stop at the dry goods for 2 things she'd forgotten on the last trip, and if the timing of that stop hadn't put them on the main street of Harlan's Crossing at the precise moment that Garrett Voss came out of the saloon with 4 men and saw them. Voss stopped on the saloon steps. The main street of Harlan's Crossing was not a wide street, and at midday it had the usual population, a few wagons, people moving between the post and the dry goods and the mill office, a couple of men sitting outside the feed store having an argument about something. It was the kind of crowd that was large enough to constitute an audience and small enough that everyone could hear everything. Voss came down the steps with his hands in his coat pockets, the warm smile in place, but something different behind it today, a harder quality. The look of a man who had received news he didn't like and was recalibrating. He'd heard about Alcott's filings. She could see it in the way he looked at her. "Evelyn," he said. He stopped 10 feet away, which was far enough to be conversational and close enough to be a statement. "I heard you've retained counsel." "You heard right. That's going to make this more complicated than it needs to be." "It's going to make it as complicated as it needs to be," she said, "which is a different thing." He looked at Caleb. Whatever softness had been in his manner in previous encounters was mostly gone now, or rather it was present in its technical sense, the voice still controlled, the face still composed, but the framework it rested on was showing through. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, not Mercer. Whitmore, deliberate, said clearly enough that the 2 men outside the feed store looked over. She saw Caleb's jaw tighten, then release. "Voss," he said, "I got an interesting message from a friend in Billings this morning. Seems Gerald Hargrove is making noise on the Northern Pacific Board about a conflict of interest question." Voss's eyes didn't leave Caleb. "You wouldn't know anything about that." "I'd know quite a bit about it," Caleb said. "Your brother is going to be very unhappy." "My brother has been unhappy with me for 6 years. I've managed." Voss took 1 step closer. Around them, the street had gone quieter, the way streets go quiet when the people on them have decided, without discussing it, that something worth watching is happening. "Let me tell you what I think," Voss said, and his voice dropped to the register of a man speaking plainly because he's decided the pleasantries are a waste of everyone's time. I think you've been hiding on this woman's property and filling her head with a story about railroad conspiracies because it serves your interest to have a local complication, slow things down while you try to reopen a settlement you agreed to 6 years ago. I think you used her. The word landed the way it was meant to, not just at Caleb, but at the audience that had accumulated, people having stopped pretending not to pay attention now. The two men by the feed store, a woman outside the post, Bertram Hoyle's hired hand who'd come to town for something and found something better. And it worked, for a half second, in the way that well-aimed untruths sometimes work. Evelyn felt the shape of it, the way it could be made to look true, the way a stranger arriving in a blizzard and staying through a winter could be recast as calculation rather than accident. Then she stepped forward. She didn't plan it. It was not a strategic decision. It was the decision of a woman who had listened to a man describe her life in terms that were wrong in every particular that mattered, and who had reached, very simply and completely, the end of her willingness to stand quietly while that happened. "Mr. Voss," she said. He looked at her, slightly surprised. She thought he'd expected Caleb to respond. "Caleb Mercer, or Whitmore, or whatever name serves your argument today. He showed up at my door in a blizzard with a hurt side and a half-frozen child, and I let him in because the alternative was watching a boy freeze to death on my porch." She said it at a normal volume, which was enough. The street was quiet. "He fixed my fence. He repaired my barn roof. He chopped more firewood than I'll burn in 2 winters. He did every one of those things without being asked and without taking anything in return." She paused. "He never once told me he could fix my debt or save my land. He never offered me anything except work and honesty when I pushed him to it." Voss opened his mouth. "I'm not finished," she said, and he closed it. "You've been in this valley for 3 weeks trying to convince me and 3 other families that selling our land to you is the sensible thing. You've been doing it with lawyers from Billings and pressure on our bank, and the implication that if we don't cooperate, the legal weight you can bring will make cooperation look attractive, eventually." She looked at him steadily. "You've never once asked what this land means to the people on it. You've never once treated it as anything other than a number in a column. And that's your right, legally. But don't stand in the middle of this street and tell me that the man who spent 3 weeks doing the work my father used to do, doing it well, doing it right, not because he needed to prove something, but because it needed doing. Don't tell me he's the dishonest one in this conversation." The street was very quiet. Voss looked at her for a moment. His expression had gone through several things in quick succession: irritation, recalculation, something that might have been a reluctant and very brief recognition, and arrived at a controlled blankness that told her he was deciding what the room required. "You're making a mistake," he said, and his voice was still even, but it was even in the way a thing is even when it's being held even. "I've made plenty of mistakes," she said. "I know what they feel like. This isn't one." He looked past her at Caleb. A long look, assessing. Then Caleb spoke, and when he did, it was clear he'd been deciding what to say for the last 3 minutes, and what he had decided was to say the most specific, most verifiable, most damaging accurate thing he knew. "The Northern Pacific Secondary Route Survey was modified in September of last year," Caleb said. He said it conversationally, at a volume the street could hear. "The original survey ran 2 miles north of this valley. The modified survey brought it south through the corridor you've been assembling. The modification was requested by the Whitmore Northern's legal office, my brother's legal office, and approved by 2 Northern Pacific board members who have investment positions in Whitmore Northern subsidiaries." He paused. "I have the documentation. Gerald Hargrove has the documentation. It will be in front of the full Northern Pacific board on Thursday." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. This one had weight to it. Voss's face had gone still in the way faces go still when the person behind them is doing rapid arithmetic. "That's a serious allegation," he said. "It's a serious document," Caleb said. "You can allege things about me all you like. What's in that boardroom on Thursday is paper, dated paper, with signatures on it." One of Voss's men, the younger one, the one with the paper-carrying look, said something quiet in Voss's ear. Voss didn't respond visibly, but his eyes shifted, just slightly. The man from the feed store, older, gray-haired, A face Evelyn knew as Henry Marsh, who owned the property 2 miles east of Bertram Hoyle, said from where he was standing, "I've had Voss's people on my property twice in the last month, telling me the railroad coming through was certain and I should sell before the value dropped." He said it without drama, just laying it out. "If the route was changed to serve a private interest, I'd like to know that before I sign anything." Voss turned toward him. "I'd like to know it too," said the woman outside the post. Evelyn didn't know her well. She was from one of the farther properties, a widow named Sasha Crane, who ran sheep on land that bordered the proposed corridor. It was not a crowd turning on a man. It was something quieter and more durable than that. 3, 4 people saying out loud what they'd been calculating privately, the arithmetic of their own situation suddenly visible in a new way. Voss stood in the middle of it, and his warm eyes moved around the small audience and found nothing useful in any of them. His face did the thing faces do when a position has become untenable, and the person holding it is deciding how to exit it without surrendering more than they have to. "This isn't the place for this conversation," he said, to no one in particular. "You made it the place," Evelyn said. "You came out here." He looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite anger and not quite respect, but occupied the uncomfortable space between them. Then he put his gloves on and said, "My offer stands. You have until the end of the week." He said it to Evelyn, and it landed differently than it had before. Not as pressure, but as the last move of a hand that had run out of cards, the formal statement of a position that everyone present now understood was weakening. He went back up the saloon steps with his men, and the door closed behind him, and the street exhaled. Henry Marsh walked over. He was a solid man, slow-moving, with the deliberate quality of someone who didn't do anything quickly because he'd learned that quick decisions in hard country were usually wrong decisions. He looked at Evelyn and then at Caleb and said, "What's going to happen Thursday?" It wasn't a question. "The board meets," Caleb said. "If Hargrove has enough support, the right-of-way decision gets reopened. If it gets reopened, Voss's land assembly loses its value because the road is no longer certain. And if Hargrove doesn't have enough support, then we're in a different situation." Caleb said it honestly, without dressing it up. "But we're in a better position than we were a week ago regardless." Marsh looked at him for a long moment, the assessment of a man who spent 40 years deciding which people to trust in a place that punished bad decisions. "What do you need from us?" "Letters," Caleb said. "Anyone who's been approached by Voss's people about selling, the date, what was said, how the approach was made. Hargrove can use that pattern to demonstrate the land assembly was coordinated in advance of the route decision, which is the piece that makes it a board problem rather than just a business dispute." Marsh nodded slowly. "I can get you 4 or 5 letters by tomorrow morning. That would help." Sasha Crane, who had come closer during this exchange, said, "I can give you 6. He's had men on my property 3 times." She said it with the flat certainty of a woman who had been keeping count. Evelyn looked at these 2 people, and then at the street, at the small cluster of faces that had stayed rather than drifting off, and she felt something that she was careful not to overstate to herself. Not victory, not safety, not any of the conclusive things. Just the first solid ground after a long stretch of uncertain footing. The feeling of a board that holds your weight when you weren't sure it would. She looked at Caleb. He was looking at her, and he had the expression she'd seen on the ridge. The open, unsettled look of someone in the middle of something real that they hadn't planned for. Not the controlled blankness, and not the rehearsed version of himself. Just the man, standing in a cold street in a small Montana town, in the middle of a situation that had gotten away from every script he'd brought to it. "You didn't have to do that," he said, quietly, so only she heard. "What you said. I know. You could have stayed out of it." "I could have stayed out of a blizzard too," she said. "I seem to have trouble with that." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, but was the most complete version of the thing that had been suggested by its shadow many times. And then it was gone, because there were people around them and things to do, but she'd seen it, and she filed it where she filed things that mattered. They rode home in the early afternoon under a sky that had made good on its morning threat, snow coming in lazy, unhurried flakes that didn't amount to much, but reminded you of what the season was still capable of. Evelyn rode beside Caleb, and neither of them talked much, which was fine. They were past the point where silence needed to be filled. Back at Hoyle's place, they collected Noah, who had apparently spent the afternoon helping Bertram mend a piece of harness and had an opinion about the correct way to do it that differed from Bertram's, and that he explained to his father in detail on the ride home. Caleb listened and asked 2 questions, and Noah answered both and then went quiet, apparently satisfied with having registered his position on the matter. The 3 of them rode up the lane to the cabin in the early dark, the mountains invisible now behind the cloud cover, the cabin's single-lit window a yellow square in the gray. That evening, Caleb wrote the statement for Hargrove. He sat at the kitchen table after supper with paper and a pen and wrote for 2 hours, and Evelyn read what he wrote when he pushed it across the table to her, because he asked her to, and she corrected 2 factual inconsistencies in his timeline and 1 sentence that she thought was too careful and needed to be more direct. He looked at her changes and made them without argument, which she took as a sign that he agreed and also as a sign of how far they'd come from the man who'd answered every question with the minimum viable amount of truth. Noah, who was supposed to be asleep, appeared in the doorway at some point and looked at the papers on the table and then at his father's face and then at Evelyn's face. "Is it done?" he said. "Almost," Caleb said. "Is it going to work?" Caleb looked at the pages in front of him. The handwriting was clear, the facts laid out in sequence, 2 years of avoidance reduced to 6 pages that said the thing directly. "I don't know," he said. "Probably. Maybe." Noah absorbed this. "Okay," he said, and went back to bed. Evelyn looked at the doorway where the boy had been, and then at the man across the table from her, the lamp throwing long shadows across both of them, the fire low in the stove, the mountain outside holding them in its usual patient cold. "He trusts you completely," she said. "I know." Caleb set down the pen. "That's the part that keeps me honest, when I can't manage it for my own reasons." She thought about that, about what it meant to be someone's reason for honesty. Not a controlling thing, not a burden, but a genuine anchor, the thing you returned to when everything else was drifting. She didn't say what she was thinking, but she sat at the table for a while longer than she needed to, and he didn't get up either, and the fire burned down to coals, and outside the snow came in its quiet, unhurried way, covering the yard and the mended fence and the barn with its new roof boards, covering the lane and the road below it and the whole broad slope of the mountain, the way it covered everything up here eventually, patient, thorough, and without malice, just the nature of the place and the season doing what they always did, indifferent to the small human arrangements happening inside the walls of a 40-year-old cabin that was still, despite everything, standing. The Northern Pacific Board met on Thursday as Hargrove had promised, and Caleb was not there for it. That was the strange part. The part that Evelyn hadn't quite anticipated when she'd imagined how this would resolve. She'd expected something dramatic, a courtroom or a confrontation, some visible moment where the thing turned. Instead, the thing that changed everything happened 400 miles away in a room she'd never seen, between men she'd never met, over documents she'd only read in copy, and she and Caleb learned about it the same way they learned about the weather, after the fact, from someone who'd been closer to it. Hargrove's telegraph came on Friday afternoon, again via Decker's boy on the spotted horse, and this time Noah was the one who saw the horse coming up the lane and called out from the porch, and all 3 of them were standing in the yard when the boy arrived. Caleb read it. He read it once, quickly, and then he stood with the paper in his hand and said nothing for a moment, and Evelyn watched his face and waited. The board voted to suspend the secondary route approval pending a full conflict of interest review, he said. 7-4. He looked up. Hargrove says the letters from Marsh and Crane and the others were what moved the middle votes. The pattern of land acquisition preceding the route modification, documented, dated, in writing from the affected landowners, was what the board needed to call it a process problem, rather than a personal dispute. Evelyn let that settle in her chest. "What does that mean for Voss?" she asked. "It means he's holding land that he paid cash price for on the assumption of a railroad benefit that isn't coming. Not in this corridor, not for a long time, if ever." Caleb folded the paper carefully, the same way Noah folded things he wanted to keep. "He's not ruined. He's a wealthy man and he'll absorb the loss and move to the next thing, but he won't be taking your property." She nodded. She didn't say anything immediately. There was something she was doing internally, quietly, that needed a moment. Not celebration, because she was not much of a celebrator, and not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. It was more like the sensation of putting down something heavy that you'd been carrying for long enough that you'd partially forgotten the weight was there, and feeling for the first time the specific shape of your own hands without it. Noah said, from beside her, "Does this mean we're staying?" The question arrived without any particular weight or urgency in his voice, just the plain inquiry of a child who wants accurate information about his situation. The same tone he used when he asked about the weather or the chickens or whether supper would be ready soon. But it landed with considerable weight in the air between the two adults, and after a moment of nobody saying anything, Noah looked from his father to Evelyn and back and apparently decided that some clarification of his intent was useful. "I'm asking because I'd like to stay," he said. "I like it here. I like Monday and Tuesday. I like the way the mountain looks in the morning when the sun comes first and the shadow is still on the valley." He paused. "I like Evelyn." "Noah," Caleb said. "I'm just saying what's true." Evelyn looked at the boy, at the total earnestness of him, the complete absence of manipulation in his face. He was simply reporting his honest assessment of the situation the way he always reported his honest assessments, without ornamentation. "I like you too," she said. "Both of you." She went inside before the moment could become something she didn't know how to manage. Tumkin. The next weeks had a quality that Evelyn found difficult to categorize and eventually stopped trying to categorize, deciding it was more useful to simply live inside it than to name it. The immediate pressure was gone. Alcott had received formal confirmation from the bank and Billings that the note would not be called during the review period, which Alcott said could last 6 months and might last longer if Hargrove pushed for a comprehensive audit of the route decision. Voss had left Harlan's Crossing the week after the board vote, and the 2 men he'd had in the valley went with him. Henry Marsh reported that someone had made a quiet offer to buy back the option on his property at the price Voss had paid for it, which Marsh took as confirmation that Voss was cutting his losses and moving on. The valley settled back into itself. Late winter gave way to the ambiguous season that passed for early spring at this elevation, the snow retreating slowly from the lower meadows while holding firmly to the high slopes, the ground alternating between frozen and barely not frozen in a way that made the ranch work complicated but possible. There were things to do. There were always things to do. Caleb stayed. Not by formal agreement, not by declaration. He simply continued to be present, continued to work, and Evelyn continued to not ask him to leave. And after a certain number of weeks, that arrangement solidified into something that didn't require the question anymore. He wrote to Hargrove again. Not about the board situation, which was proceeding without his active involvement, but about the matter of his brother and the settlement and whether the conduct Caleb had documented gave grounds to revisit the original terms. Hargrove wrote back with the opinion of a man who had seen a great many legal situations and was being careful about this one. "Possibly," he said. "Possibly, if the right people were willing to take the right positions. It would be long. It would be expensive. And the outcome was not guaranteed." Caleb told Evelyn this one evening, the 2 of them at the table in the now familiar arrangement, Noah asleep, the fire going, the mountain doing its quiet work outside. "Are you going to pursue it?" she asked. "I don't know yet." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "There's a version of it where I spend the next 3 years in legal proceedings and win something on paper, and it doesn't change a single practical thing about my life. And there's a version where it changes enough that it matters." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm trying to figure out which version I'm actually in. What would it change, if you won?" "The settlement gave Richard the operating company, the railroad." He paused. "If the settlement terms were violated, the question of the original inheritance reopens. That could mean a lot of things. A share of the company, compensation. Standing in the industry I spent the first 15 years of my adult life actually understanding. Is that what you want?" He looked at her. It was a real question, and he treated it like one, not answering immediately. "I don't want the company," he said. "I don't want to run a railroad. I think I did once, or I wanted to want it, which is a different thing, and one I should have examined more carefully." He set the cup down. "What I want is to not have walked away with nothing. Not for financial reasons, just He stopped, started again. Richard behaved badly. He used Clara's death. He used my state of mind when I was least able to protect my own interests. I'd like that to be on record somewhere, even if nothing practical comes of it. Evelyn thought about her father, about the complicated arithmetic of inheriting from a person who was not entirely what they should have been, about what it meant to carry both the debt and the love and not be able to separate them cleanly. That's a real reason, she said. That's worth pursuing. It's going to cost time and money I don't have a lot of. Alcott knows people in Helena. He mentioned it. She paused. And there's going to be a better year this year. I can feel it in the land. The winter broke cleaner than the last two. If the south pasture produces what I think it can, there'll be something to work with. He looked at her. You're talking about funding a legal fight with pasture grass. I'm talking about not deciding things are impossible before they've had a chance to be possible. She met his gaze. You know the difference between those two things. He was quiet. Something moved in his face. You sound like Clara, he said, and it came out without premeditation. She could hear that. It surprised him slightly, the way true things sometimes do when they arrive before you've vetted them. She didn't know what to do with that exactly. She sat with it for a moment, and then she said, She sounds like she was a sensible woman. She was. He looked at his hands. She also would have liked you. She had a way of... He stopped. She would have walked up to you and said something direct and slightly inconvenient, and you'd have been annoyed by it and respected it at the same time. I have that effect on people, Evelyn said. He looked at her then, and it was the look she'd been aware of for weeks without fully looking at directly. The way you're aware of a light source at the edge of your vision and choose to keep your eyes forward, because looking at it directly would require you to acknowledge what you're doing. He had looked at her with that particular quality since sometime in the third week, maybe the second, and she'd had the awareness of it in the peripheral vision sense and had been doing the honest but not quite honest thing of filing it under things to think about later. She looked at it directly now. I don't know what I'm doing, she said, about any of this, about you being here, about what that means. I know, he said. I don't either. I'm not good at... She stopped, tried for the accurate version. I've been alone for a long time by choice as much as circumstance. I made that choice because trusting arrangements was expensive and I didn't have the surplus for it. She looked at him steadily. I'm not sure I've changed that much. I'm not sure this, whatever this is, doesn't run straight into that wall eventually. It might, he said. I don't have a guarantee to offer you. I'm not in a position to offer guarantees. I have 2 horses and a son and a legal dispute that may or may not go anywhere and a job in Millerton that I haven't actually started yet. And a name you just learned to say out loud again. And that, he said. She looked at the table between them, at the familiar grain of the wood her father had hauled up this mountain 40 years ago, at the lamp and the coffee cups and the ledger she'd closed an hour earlier. Stay through the spring, she said. The south pasture work needs 2 people, and Noah is a good hand for his age, but he can't drive fence posts yet. The side of his mouth moved. That's a practical argument. I make practical arguments, she said. It's what I have. It's enough, he said, and meant it, and she could hear that he meant it, and she let it be enough for now, which was about as much as either of them was capable of, which was fine. It was more than either of them had expected to find on the other side of a winter like this one. Spring came in the grudging, incremental way it came to the high country, not arriving so much as accreting, degree by degree and day by day, until one morning Evelyn stepped outside before coffee, and the air had a quality she hadn't felt since October. Not warm exactly, not even close, but with the faintest suggestion of something underneath the cold that was different from cold, a kind of aliveness in it. The south pasture produced well. Better than she'd projected, which was the kind of outcome she still distrusted slightly even when it was happening, the habit of bracing for the catch. She and Caleb brought in the first cutting of the season in June, a 2-day job in good weather, and by the end of the second day she was satisfied with what she saw in the barn and in the ledger. The note payment in September was the largest she'd made in 4 years. Alcott wrote to confirm the bank's receipt of it with the particular satisfaction of a man who likes things going in the right direction. Caleb's legal matter moved in the way that legal matters moved, slowly, with occasional bursts of activity that required his attention and then long, flat stretches of waiting. Hargrove was a useful ally, patient and methodical, and the attorney he'd connected Caleb with in Helena turned out to be exactly the right kind of person for this kind of fight. Someone who understood railroads and settlements and the ways inherited companies could be mismanaged by the people who took them over. By September, there were preliminary filings on record. By November, there was a response from Richard Whitmore's legal team that Caleb described as expensive and defensive, which Alcott said was a positive indicator. None of it was fast. None of it was clean. But it was moving. Noah turned 8 in July, and Evelyn made a cake, which she hadn't made in years, discovering partway through the process that she'd forgotten 2 steps and had to improvise in ways that produced something structurally questionable but edible. And Noah ate 2 pieces and said it was the best cake he'd ever had, which was clearly not true and was also, she thought, the kindest thing he could have said. He'd started helping her with the morning chores as a matter of course, not because he was asked, but because the rhythm of the work had absorbed him the way it absorbed everyone who stayed on a working ranch long enough. You stopped being a visitor to the schedule and started being part of it. He had opinions about the chickens, which had been joined by 4 more that spring, and he had a system for collecting eggs that he developed himself and was prepared to defend at length. Caleb watched his son move around the property with an ease that the boy hadn't carried 2 years ago or 6 months ago, and he didn't say anything about it, but sometimes in the evenings when Noah was outside and the 2 of them were inside, the absence of what he'd otherwise say filled the room in a particular way. One evening in October, with the first cold coming back and the leaves on the lower aspens gone to gold, Caleb said, "I want to ask you something." She was at the stove. She didn't turn around. "Ask it." "I want to stay. Not through the spring. Not as a practical arrangement." He paused. "I want to make this permanent, if that's something you want." She turned around. He was standing at the table, not sitting, which told her this was something he'd been working up to for longer than the moment suggested. He had the look he got when he was saying the real thing rather than the manageable version of it. Slightly uncomfortable, entirely honest. "I'm not asking because you need help with the ranch," he said, "or because I don't have anywhere else to go. I have Millerton, and I have what's coming out of the legal situation, whatever that ends up being." He looked at her directly. "I'm asking because this is where I want to be. You and Noah and this stubborn piece of mountain. That's what I'm asking about." She stood at the stove and looked at him and ran the honest accounting, the way she always did. Not to find reasons against it, but to see what was actually there. What was there? A man who had come to her door with nothing and had given everything he had while he was here. Who had told her the truth, eventually, even when it cost him. Who worked alongside her without making her feel like a project or obligation, who sat with his son in the evenings and listened to the boy talk about chickens and fence posts and mathematical observations about the angle of the morning shadow on the south slope with the kind of genuine attention that could not be performed. It was either real or it wasn't, and it was real. What was also there? Her own stubbornness, her genuine capacity for solitude. The wall she'd described to him honestly months ago. The wall was still there. She wasn't pretending otherwise. But walls were structures, and she'd grown up watching her father build structures. And what she'd learned from that was that a structure could be a barrier, or it could be a foundation depending on what you built next to it and how. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I know that. I have strong opinions about the correct way to do most things. I've noticed, and I'm going to keep the land in my name. My family's land stays in my name." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said, and meant it, and she could hear that he meant it. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right, yes, or all right, you've noted my position?" "All right, yes," she said. "Don't make me say it twice." Something happened to his face that she decided not to describe precisely, even to herself, because some things were diminished by close examination. She turned back to the stove and finished what she was doing, and a minute later he was beside her because there was something that needed passing. And the distance between them in that kitchen that evening was a different distance than it had been in November when a stranger had stood in her doorway and she'd made a calculation about a child she didn't know. They married in the spring, the following May, which was Evelyn's idea, which surprised Caleb and which she explained practically. If they were going to do it, they should do it when the pass was clear and people could get there, and May was the first clear month. The ceremony was in the yard, performed by a circuit judge who came through the valley twice a year and who had the businesslike warmth of a man who'd done this many times and respected it every time. Bertram Hoyle came. Sasha Crane came with her eldest daughter. Tom Alcott came and brought his wife, who turned out to have strong opinions about cake that she shared with Noah at length. And Noah engaged with this seriously because Noah engaged with everything seriously. Henry Marsh came. A few others from the valley, people Evelyn had known for years at a functional distance, and who now, somehow, had closed to something closer over the winter and its aftermath. The shared experience of having stood in a cold street and said, "I'd like to know that too," being the kind of thing that changed the nature of a neighborly acquaintance in ways that were hard to undo. Caleb's side of the thing was Gerald Hargrove, who had made the trip from Billings because, he said in his formal, unhurried way, he had wanted to meet the woman who had evidently been responsible for Caleb Whitmore deciding to exist again. He was older than Evelyn had imagined, white-haired and careful in his movements, with the kind of intelligence that showed up not as sharpness, but as precision. Everything he said exactly as much as it needed to be, nothing wasted. He shook Evelyn's hand before the ceremony and said, "I knew his father. Edmund was a complicated man," which is a polite way of saying he made as many problems as he solved. Caleb is different. He just needed to stop running long enough to figure out what he actually wanted. He looked at her with the calm assessment of a man who'd seen a great many arrangements in his life and could evaluate them quickly. It appears he found it. "We found it," she said. Hargrove smiled slightly. "Yes, I imagine that's precisely right." Noah stood beside his father during the ceremony with his hands folded in front of him, wearing a shirt that was slightly too large because they'd bought it for room to grow. And he hadn't finished growing into it yet, and he watched the proceedings with his customary focused attention. When the judge got to the part where he asked if anyone had objections, Noah said, clearly and without any apparent irony, "No objections," which produced a laugh from the small assembly that was warm rather than mocking, the laugh of people who recognized a child being entirely themselves. When the afternoon was getting long and people were beginning to think about the ride home, Evelyn found herself standing at the edge of the yard alone for a few minutes, looking out at the view that opened up to the south, the valley and the mountains beyond it, and the road that wound down to Harlan's Crossing, visible in pieces through the pines. The peaks were still white at the top, but the lower slopes were green now, the aspens in full leaf, the meadows in the first rich color of the short mountain summer. She'd looked at this view for 4 years alone. Her father had looked at it for 40 years before that. She thought about what it meant to inherit a place, not just the legal deed and the note at the bank, but the weight of a thing that had cost someone everything they had. Franklin Hartwell had dragged timber up this slope because he wanted to see what was coming. He'd wanted to be high enough to have warning. She understood that better now than she had when she was young. The drive to position yourself where nothing could sneak up on you, where you could see the shape of the land and the weather moving across it, and have at least a few minutes to prepare. The problem with that logic was that it assumed the important things announced themselves from a distance. They didn't. The important things knocked on your door at night in the middle of a blizzard. They showed up unexpected and inconvenient, and they asked you to make a decision in the dark with incomplete information, and they didn't give you the luxury of seeing from a distance first. She'd opened the door. That was all she'd done, and it had cost her the winter, her wood, her food, her solitude, her careful arrangements. It had cost her the life she'd built around managing alone, which had been a working life, but not a whole one, though she hadn't had the referent to understand that until she had something to compare it to. What she had now instead was not what she'd planned, and was considerably more complicated than what she'd planned and was, she thought, looking at the valley and the mountains and the peaks still white against the late afternoon blue, probably closer to what she actually needed than anything she could have planned would have been. There was a human lesson in that, though she was not a person who stated lessons as such. She thought of it more as an observation, that the difference between a hard life and a bare life was not the hardship itself, but the question of who you carried it with. That belonging was not a thing assigned to you by birth or station, but a thing you built with your hands and your presence and your willingness to open a door when every sensible instinct told you to keep it closed. That the people who changed the direction of your life rarely arrived with introductions. They arrived exhausted, in the dark, asking for nothing more than somewhere to put down what they'd been carrying. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, what they were carrying was something you'd been missing without knowing it. She heard Caleb's step behind her. She didn't turn around. He came to stand beside her, and they stood the way they'd stood on the ridge that morning when she'd followed his tracks through the snow and told him to stop hiding, close enough to feel the warmth off each other in the mountain air, looking at the same view. "Hargrove is leaving tomorrow," he said. "I know. I'll feed him breakfast." "He liked you." "He liked that I was direct with him. He doesn't get that much." "No," Caleb said. "He doesn't." The light was going golden and long across the valley now, the particular light of a Montana May evening that didn't seem real even when you were standing in it. The mountains held the color for a long time before releasing it. "How's the south pasture look?" Caleb asked. "Better than last year. We should extend the fence line on the eastern edge. There's another quarter-acre of usable land that's just going to scrub." "I know. I've been thinking about it since February. We could do it in 2 days if we start early." "We could," she said. "Next week." A pause, comfortable, the kind that didn't need anything done with it. Noah came across the yard at a run and stopped himself at the last second, not quite crashing into his father's side. And Caleb put one arm around the boy without looking, the automatic precision of a man who knew exactly where his child was at all times. Noah leaned against him and looked out at the valley with the same expression the adults wore. Not awed exactly, but present in it, aware of the view in the way you were aware of something that was partly yours. "Monday laid 2 eggs today," Noah said. "Did she?" "Bertram said it's too cold for 2 eggs. Bertram's been telling me how cold it is for things since I got here," Evelyn said. "Monday hasn't gotten the message." Noah grinned. It was a good grin. Open, unguarded, the face of a child who'd arrived somewhere he didn't have to protect himself from. The light went another shade toward evening. The mountains went from gold to rose to the particular gray-blue of a clear Montana dusk, and the valley below caught the last of the color and held it for a while. And the 3 of them stood at the edge of the yard in the cooling air, looking out at the land that had cost everything it had cost and given back what it had given. And the cabin behind them threw its warm square of window light onto the ground, the fire going inside, the supper waiting. This was not an easy place. It had never been an easy place, and it would not become one. The winters would come back hard, as they always did, and there would be years when the numbers in the ledger would not cooperate, and years when the land would not cooperate, and years when the 2 of them would not cooperate, because that was the nature of complicated people making a life in close quarters in a place that asked a great deal and offered beauty as partial compensation. None of that was going to change. What had changed was simpler and more durable than any of it. There was a light in the window, there was supper on the stove, there was a boy naming chickens after days of the week, and a man who'd finally stopped running, and a woman who'd spent 4 years alone on a mountain and had learned the hard way, in the best possible sense of that phrase, that opening the door was always the right answer, even when it was dark, even when you were afraid, even when everything you'd built told you to stay inside and keep what you had. Especially then.